Hold up. Did we just teleport to Athens? In Chapter 38, we found Sayil, and this great palace is a total architectural flex. We're talking 3 stories of massive limestone, covered in columns that look like they belong in a Greek temple, not a Mexican jungle. It's a stone giant that breaks all the rules. Before we storm the palace, join the crew, subscribe, and show some love like. And let's see the day ones. Where is the squad checking in from today? Drop your coordinates in the comments. Tonight, we're breaking down the Jungle Parthenon. Stevens is losing his mind over the symmetry and the design. Imagine finding an 85-room mansion in a place where everyone thought savages lived. It's a masterclass in ancient engineering that's been sitting in silence for 1,000 years. Dim the lights. The stone is talking. Let's get into it.
Chapter 38.
At 7 o'clock, we went down to the shore to embark. The boatman whom the Juez had consulted, and for whom he had been so tenacious, were his honor himself and another man, who, we thought, was hired as the cheapest help he could find in the village. The canoe was about 40 feet long, with a toldo or awning of about 12 feet at the stern, and covered with matting. All the space before this was required by the boatman to work the canoe, and, with all our luggage under the awning, we had but narrow quarters. The seeming lake on which we started was merely a large inundated plain, covered with water to the depth of 3 or 4 feet, and the Juez in the stern, his assistant before, walking in the bottom of the canoe, with poles against their shoulders, set her across. At 8 o'clock we entered a narrow, muddy creek, not wider than a canal, but very deep and with the current against us. The setting pole could not touch the bottom, but it was forked at one end, and, keeping close to the bank, the bowgadder or rower fixed it against the branches of overhanging trees, and pushed, while the Juez, whose pole had a rude hook, fastened to other branches forward and pulled. In this way, with no view but that of the wooded banks, we worked slowly along the muddy stream. In turning a short bend, suddenly we saw on the banks 8 or 10 alligators, some of them 20 feet long, huge, hideous monsters, appropriate inhabitants of such a stream, and, considering the frailty of our little vessel, not very attractive neighbors. As we approached, they plunged heavily into the water, sometimes rose in the middle of the stream, and swam across or disappeared. At 12:30 we entered the Rio Chico or Little River, varying from 200 to 500 feet in width, deep, muddy, and very sluggish, with wooded banks of impenetrable thickness. At 6 o'clock we entered the great Usumasinta, 500 or 600 yards across, one of the noblest rivers in Central America, rising among the mountains of Peten, and emptying into the lake of Terminos. At this point, the 3 provinces of Chiapas, Tabasco, and Yucatan meet, and the junction of the waters of the Usumasinta and the Rio Chico presents a singular spectacle. Since leaving the sheet of water before the Playas, we have been ascending the stream, but now, continuing the same direction and crossing the line of junction, we came from the ascending current of the Rio Chico into the descending flow of the Usumasinta. Working out into middle and looking back, we saw the Usumasinta and Rio Chico coming together and forming an angle of not more than 40 degrees, one running up and the other down, amid the wildness and stillness of the majestic river, and floating in a little canoe. The effect was very extraordinary, but the cause was obvious. 1. At this time, away from the wooded banks, with the setting poles at rest, and floating quietly on the bosom of the noble Usumasinta, our situation was pleasant and exciting. A strong wind sweeping down the river drove away the mosquitoes, and there were no gathering clouds to indicate rain. We had expected to come to for the night, but the evening was so clear that we determined to continue. Unfortunately, we were obliged to leave the Usumasinta and, about an hour after dark, turned to the north into the Rio Palisada. The whole Great Plain from Palenque to the Gulf of Mexico is broken by creeks and streams. The Usumasinta in its stately course receives many and sends off others to find their way by separate channels to the sea, leaving the broad expanse of the Usumasinta with a comparative light. The Rio Palisada, narrow and with a dark line of forest on each side, had an aspect fearfully ominous of mosquitoes. Unfortunately, at the very beginning we brushed against the bank and took on board enough to show us the bloodthirsty character of the natives. Of course, that night afforded us little sleep. At daylight, we were still dropping down the river. This was the region of the great Logwood country. We met a large bungo with two masts moving against the stream, set up by hauling and pushing on the branches of trees, on her way for a cargo. As we advanced, the banks of the river in some places were cleared and cultivated, and had whitewashed houses, and small sugar mills turned by oxen, and canoes were lying on the water. Altogether the scene was pretty, but with the richness of the soil suggesting the idea how beautiful this country might be made.
At 2 o'clock we reached the Palisada, situated on the left bank of the river, on a luxuriant plain elevated some 15 or 20 feet. Several bungos lay along the bank, and in front was a long street with large and well-built houses. This our first point was in the state of Yucatan, then in revolution against the government of Mexico. Our descent of the river had been watched from the bank, and before we landed we were hailed, asked for our passports, and directed to present ourselves immediately to the alcalde. The intimation was peremptory, and we proceeded forthwith to the alcalde. Don Francisco Hebrew was superior to any man I had yet found at the head of a municipality. In fact, he was chief of the Liberal party in that section of the state, and like all the other officials in the Mexican provinces, received us with the respect due to an official passport of a friendly nation. We were again in the midst of a revolution, but had not the remotest idea what it was about. We were most intimately acquainted with Central American politics, but this was of no more use to us than a knowledge of Texan politics would be to a stranger in the United States. For several months the names of Morazan and Carrera had rung in our ears like those of our own candidates for the presidency at a contested election, but we had passed the limits of their world and were obliged to begin anew. For 8 years the Central Party had maintained the ascendancy in Mexico, during which time, as a mark of the sympathy between neighboring people, the Liberal or Democratic Party had been ascendant in Central America. Within the last 6 months the Centralists had overturned the Liberals in Central America, and during the same time the Liberalists had almost driven out the Centralists in Mexico. Along the whole coast of the Pacific the Liberals were in arms, waging a strong revolutionary war and threatening the capital, which they afterwards entered, but after great massacre and bloodshed were expelled. On the Atlantic side, the states of Tabasco and Yucatan had declared their independence of the general government, and in the interior of both states the officials of the central government had been driven out. The seaports of Tabasco and Campeche, garrisoned by central troops, still held but they were at that time blockaded and besieged on land by the federal forces. All communications by sea and land were cut off, their supplies were short, and Don Francisco thought they would soon be obliged by starvation to surrender. The revolution seemed of a higher tone for greater cause, and conducted with more moderation than in Central America. The grounds of revolt here were the despotism of the central government, which, far removed by position and ignorant of the condition and resources of the country, used its distant provinces as a quartering place for rapacious officers, and a source of revenue for money to be squandered in the capital. One little circumstance showed the impolicy and inefficiency of the laws. On account of high duties, smuggling was carried to such an extent on the coast that many articles were regularly sold at the Palisada for much less than the duties. The revolution, like all others in that country, began with pronunciamentos, i.e. declarations of the municipality, or what we should call the corporation of a town, in favor of any particular party. The Palisada had made its pronunciamento but 2 weeks before. The central officers had been turned out, and the present alcalde was hardly warm in his place. The change, however, had been effected with a spirit of moderation and forbearance, and without bloodshed. Don Francisco, with a liberality unusual, spoke of his immediate predecessor as an upright but misguided man, who was not persecuted, but then living in the place unmolested. The liberals, however, did not expect the same treatment at the hands of the centralists. An invasion had been apprehended from Tabasco. Don Francisco had his silver and valuables packed up, and kept his bungo before the door to save his effects and family, and the place was alive with patriots brushing up arms and preparing for war.
Don Francisco was a rich man, had a hacienda of 30,000 head of cattle, logwood plantations, and bungos, and was rated at $200,000. The house in which he lived was on the bank of the river, newly built, 150 feet front, and it cost him $20,000 or 4,000L. While we were with him, dinner was about being served, in a liberal style of housekeeping unusual in that country, and with the freedom of a man who felt sure that he could not be taken unawares, he asked us to join him at table. Don Francisco had never traveled farther than Tabasco and Campeche, but he was well acquainted with Europe and the United States, geographically and politically. Indeed, he was one of the most agreeable companions and best-informed men we met in that country. We remained with him all the afternoon, and toward evening moved our chairs outside in front of the house, which at evening was a regular gathering place of family. The bank of the river was a promenade for the people of the town, who stopped to exchange greetings with Don Francisco and his wife. A vacant chair was always at hand, and from time to time one took a seat with us. When the vesper bell struck, conversation ceased. All rose from their seats, made a short prayer, and when it was over, turned to each other with a buenas noces, good evening, reseated themselves, and renewed the conversation. There was always something imposing in the sound of the vesper bell, presenting the idea of an immense multitude of people at the same moment offering up a prayer. During the evening, a courier arrived with dispatches for Don Francisco, bringing intelligence that a town which had pronounced in favor of the liberals had pronounced back again, which seemed to give both him and his wife much uneasiness. At 10 o'clock an armed patrol came for orders, and we retired to what we much needed, a good night's rest. In the morning, Don Francisco, half in jest and half in earnest, told us of the uneasiness we had given his wife. Palling Spanish and constant use of idioms well known as belonging to the city of Mexico had excited her suspicions. She said he was not an American, but a Mexican from the capital, and she believed him to be a spy of the Centralists. Palling did not like the imputation. He was a little mortified at this visible mark of long absence from his country, and not at all flattered at being taken for a Mexican. Don Francisco laughed at it, but his wife was so pertinacious that, if it had not been for the apparent propriety of my being attended by one perfectly familiar with the language of the country, I believe in a state of apprehension and distrust. Pauling would have lost the benefit of his birthright and been arrested as a spy. We passed the next day in a quiet lounge and in making arrangements for continuing our journey, and the next day after, furnished with luxurious supply of provisions by the Senora, and accompanied to the place by Don Francisco, we embarked on board a bungo for the Laguna. The bungo was about 15 tons burden, flat-bottomed, with 2 masts and sails, and loaded with logwood. The deck was covered with mangoes, plantains, and other fruits and vegetables, and so encumbered that it was impossible to move. The stern had movable hatches. A few tiers of logwood had been taken out, and the hatches put over so as to give us a shelter against rain. A sail was rigged into an awning to protect us from the sun, and in a few minutes we pushed off from the bank. We had as passengers 2 young Central Americans from Peten, both under 20, and flying on account of the dominion of the Carrera party. Coming, as we did, direct from Central America, we called each other countrymen. We soon saw that the bungo had a miserable crew. Upriver the men were called bogadores or rowers, but here, as they were on board a bungo with sails, and going down to the seacoast, they called themselves marineros or sailors. The patron or master was a mild, inoffensive, and inefficient man who prefaced all his orders to his breechless marineros with conciliatory words. Senors, hagen me el favor, gentlemen, do me the favor. Below the town commenced an island, about 4 leagues in length, at the end of which, on the main land, was a large clearing and farming establishment, with canoes lying on the water. All traveling here is along the river and in canoes. From this place there were no habitations. The river was very deep, the banks densely wooded, with the branches spreading far over.
Very soon we came to a part of the river where the alligators seemed to enjoy undisturbed possession. Some lay basking in the sun on mud banks like logs of driftwood, and in many places the river was dotted with their heads. The Spanish historian says that they swim with their head above the water, gaping at whatsoever they see and swallow it, whether stick, stone, or living creature, which is the true reason of their swallowing stones, and not to sink to the bottom as some say, for they have no need to do so, nor do they like it, being extraordinary swimmers. For the tail serves instead of a rudder, the head is the prow, and the paws the oars, being so swift as to catch any other fish as it swims. 100.5 of fresh fish has been found in the maw of an alligator, besides what was digested. In another was an Indian woman whole with her clothes whom he had swallowed the day before, and another with a pair of gold bracelets with pearls, the enamel gone off and part of the pearls dissolved, but the gold entire. Here they still maintain their dominion. Accidents frequently happen, and at the Palisada, Don Francisco told us that a year before a man had had his leg bitten off and was drowned. 3 were lying together at the mouth of a small stream which emptied into the river. The patron told us that at the end of the last dry season upward of 200 had been counted in the bed of a pond emptied by this stream. The boatmen of several bungos went in among them with clubs, sharp stakes, and machetes and killed upward of 60. The river itself, discolored with muddy banks and a fiery sun beating upon it, was ugly enough, but these huge and ugly monsters, neither fish nor flesh, made it absolutely hideous. The boatmen called them enemigos de los cristianos, by which they mean enemies of mankind. In a canoe it would have been unpleasant to disturb them, but in the bungo we brought out our guns and made indiscriminate war. One monster, 25 or 30 feet long, lay on the arm of a gigantic tree, which projected 40 or 50 feet, the lower part covered with water, but the whole of the alligator was visible. He was hit just under the white line. He fell off and with a tremendous convulsion reddening the water with a circle of blood, turned over on his back, dead. A boatman and one of the Peten lads got into a canoe to bring him alongside. The canoe was small and tottering, and had not proceeded 50 yards before it dipped, filled, upset, and threw them both into the water. At that moment there were perhaps 20 alligators in sight on the banks and swimming in different parts of the river. We could do nothing for the man and boy, and the old bungo, which before hardly moved, seemed to start forward purposely to leave them to their fate. Every moment the distance between us and them increased, and on board all was confusion. The patron cried out in agony to the señors, and the señors, straining every nerve, turned the bungo into the bank, and got the masts foul of the branches of the trees, which held her fast. In the meantime our friends in the water were not idle. The Peten lad struck out vigorously toward the shore, and we saw him seize the branch of a tree, which projected 50 feet over the water, so low as to be within reach, haul himself up like a monkey and run along it to the shore. The marinero, having the canoe to himself, turned her bottom upward, got astride and paddled down with his hands. Both got safely on board, and apprehension over, the affair was considered a good joke. In the meantime our mast had become so locked in the branches of the trees that we carried away some of our miserable tackling in extricating them, but at length we were once more in the middle of the river, and renewed our war upon los enemigos de los cristianos. The sun was so hot that we could not stand outside the awning, but the boatman gave us notice when we could have a shot. Our track down the river will be remembered as a desolation and scourge. Old alligators, by dying injunction, will teach the rising generation to keep the head under water when the bungos are coming. We killed perhaps 20, and others are probably at this moment sitting on the banks with our bullets in their bodies, wondering how they came there. With rifles we could have killed at least 100.
At 3 o'clock the regular afternoon storm came on, beginning with a tremendous sweep of wind up the river, which turned the bungo round, drove her broadside up the stream, and before we could come to the bank we had a deluge of rain. At length we made fast, secured the hatch over the place prepared for us, and crawled under. It was so low that we could not sit up, and, lying down, there was about a foot of room above us. On our arrival at the palisada, we considered ourselves fortunate in finding a bungo ready, although she had already on board a full load of logwood from stern to stern. Don Francisco said it would be too uncomfortable and wished us to wait for a bungo of his own, but delay was to us a worse evil, and I made a bargain to have a portion of the logwood taken out behind the mainmast, so as to admit of a hatch on deck and give room below. But we had not given any personal superintendence, and when we came on board, though the logwood seemed of a rather hard species for sleeping on, we did not discover the extreme discomfort of the place until forced below by the rain. Even the small place engaged and paid for accordingly, we had not to ourselves. The Peten lads crawled under with us, and the patron and señors followed. We could not drive them out into a merciless rain, and all lay like one mass of human flesh, animated by the same spirit of suffering, irritation, and helplessness. During this time the rain was descending in a deluge. The thunder rolled fearfully over our heads. Lightning flashed into crevices of our dark burrowing place, dazzling and blinding our eyes. We heard near us the terrific crash of a felling tree, snapped by the wind, or, as we then supposed, shivered by lightning. Such was our position. Sometimes the knots in the logwood fitted well into the curves and hollows of the body, but in general they were just where they should not be. We thought we could not be worse off, but very soon we found our mistake, and looked back upon ourselves as ungrateful murmurers without cause. The mosquitoes claimed us as waifs, and in murderous swarms found their way into the hatches, humming and buzzing. Fee, faw, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Dead or alive, I will have some. I now look back upon our troubles at that place with perfect equanimity. But at the moment, with the heat and confinement, we were in anything but an amiable humor, and at 10 o'clock broke out furious, upbraided the patron and his lazy seigneurs for not reaching the mouth of the river before night, as is usually done, and as he had been charged by the alcalde to do, and insisted upon us hauling out into the stream. The rain had ceased, but the wind was still furious and dead ahead. By the misty light we saw a large bungo, with one sail set, seemingly flying up the river like a phantom. We made the patron haul out from the bank, but we could not keep the river, and, after a few zigzag movements, were shot across to the opposite side, where we brought upon us new and more hungry swarms. Here we remained an hour longer, when the wind died away, and we pushed out into the stream. This was a great relief. The seigneurs, though more used to the scourge of mosquitoes than we, suffered quite as much. The clouds rolled away, the moon broke out, and, but for the abominable insects, our float down the wild and desolate river would have been an event to live in memory. As it was, not one of us attempted to sleep, and I verily believe a man could not have passed an entire night on the banks and lived.
At daylight we were still in the river. Very soon we reached a small lake and, making a few tacks, entered a narrow passage called the Boca Chica or Little Mouth. The water was almost even with the banks, and on each side were the most gigantic trees of the tropical forests, their roots naked 3 or 4 feet above the ground, gnarled, twisted, and interlacing each other, gray and dead-looking, and holding up, so as to afford an extended view under the first branches, a forest of vivid green. At 10 o'clock we passed the Boca Chica and entered the Lake of Terminos. Once more in salt water and stretching out under full sail, on the right we saw only an expanse of water. On the left was a border of trees with naked roots, which seemed growing out of the water, and in front, but a little to the left and barely visible, a long line of trees, marking the island of Carmen, on which stood the town of Laguna, our port of destination. The passage into the lake was shoal and narrow, with reefs and sandbars, and our boatmen did not let slip the chance of running her ashore. Their efforts to get her off capped the climax of stupidity and laziness, 1 or 2 of them pushing on poles at a time as if they were shoving off a rowboat and then stopping to rest and giving up to others. Of what could be done by united force they seemed to have no idea, and after a few ineffectual efforts, the patron said we must remain till the tide rose. We had no idea of another night on board the Bungo and took entire command of the vessel. This we were entitled to do from the physical force we brought into action, and we were altogether 4 able-bodied and desperate men. Juan's efforts were gigantic. From the great surface exposed, the mosquitoes had tormented him dreadfully, and he was even more disgusted with the Bungo than we. We put 2 of the men into the water to heave against the bottom with their shoulders, and ourselves bearing on poles all together, we shoved her off into deep water. With a gentle breeze we sailed smoothly along until we could distinguish the masts of vessels at the Laguna rising above the island, when the wind died away entirely, and left us under a broiling sun in a dead calm. At 2 o'clock we saw clouds gathering, and immediately the sky became very black, the harbinger of one of those dreadful storms which even on dry land were terrible. The hatches were put down and a tarpaulin spread over for us to take refuge under. The squall came on so suddenly that the men were taken unawares, and the confusion on board was alarming. The patron, with both hands extended and a most beseeching look, begged the señors to take in sail, and the señors, all shouting together, ran and tumbled over the logwood, hauling upon every rope but the right one. The mainsail stuck halfway up and would not come down, and while the patron and all the men were shouting and looking up at it, the marinero who had been upset in the canoe, with tears of terror actually streaming from his eyes, and a start of desperation, ran up the mast by the rings, and springing violently upon the top one, holding fast by a rope, brought the sail down with a run. A hurricane blew through the naked masts, a deluge of rain followed, and the lake was lashed into fury. We lost sight of everything. At the very beginning, on account of the confusion on board, we determined not to go under the hatch. If the Bungo swamped, the Logwood cargo would carry her to the bottom like lead. We disencumbered ourselves of boots and coats, and brought out life preservers ready for use. The deck of the Bungo was about 3 feet from the water and perfectly smooth without anything to hold on by, and to keep from being blown or washed away, we lay down and took the whole brunt of the storm. The atmosphere was black, but by the flashes we saw the bare poles of another Bungo tossed like ourselves at the mercy of the storm. This continued more than an hour, when it cleared off as suddenly as it came up, and we saw the Laguna crowded with more shipping than we had seen since we left New York. In our long inland journey we had almost forgotten the use of ships, and the very sight of them seemed to bring us into close relations with home. The squall having spent its fury, there was now a dead calm. The men took to their sweeps but made very little headway, and with the port in full sight, we had great apprehensions of another night on board, when another squall came on, not so violent, but blowing directly from the harbor. Tremendous rain accompanied it. We made 2 or 3 tacks under a close-reefed foresail. The old Bungo seemed to fly through the water, and when under full way the anchor, or to speak more correctly stone, was thrown out at some distance below the shipping, and brought us up all standing. There were breakers between us and the shore, and we hallooed to some men to come and take us off, but they answered that the breakers were too rough. The rain came on again, and for half an hour we stowed ourselves away under hatches.
As soon as it cleared off, we were on deck, and in a little time we saw a fine, jolly boat, with a coxswain and 4 men, coasting along the shore against a rapid current, the men at times jumping into the water and hauling by ropes fixed for the purpose. We hailed them in English, and the coxswain answered in the same language, that it was too rough, but after a consultation with the sailors they pushed towards us, and took Mr. Catherwood and me on board. The coxswain was the mate of a French ship, and spoke English. His ship was to sail the next day, and he was taking some large turtles, which lay on the beach waiting for him. As soon as we struck, we mounted the shoulders of 2 square-built French sailors, and were set down on shore, and perhaps in our whole tour we were never so happy as at that moment in being rid of the Bungo. The town extended along the bank of the lake. We walked the whole length of it, saw numerous and well-filled stores, cafes, and even barbers' shops. At the extreme end reached the American consuls. 2 men were sitting on the portico, of a most home-like appearance. One was Don Carlos Russell, the consul. The face of the other was familiar to me, and learning that we had come from Guatemala, he asked news of me, which I was most happy to give him in person. It was Captain Fensley, whose acquaintance I had made in New York when seeking information about that country, and with whom I had spoken of sailing to Campeche. But at the moment I did not recognize him, and in my costume from the interior it was impossible for him to recognize me. He was direct from New York, and gave the first information we had received in a long time from that place, with budgets of newspapers, burdened with suspension of specie payments and universal ruin. Some of my friends have been playing strange antics, but in important matters of marriages and deaths, I did not find anything to give me either joy or sorrow. Don Carlos Russell, or Mr. Charles Russell, was a native of Philadelphia, married to a Spanish lady of large fortune, and though long absent, received us as one who had not forgotten his home. His house, his table, all that he had, even his purse, were at our service. Our first congratulations over, we sat down to a dinner which rivaled that of our friend of Totonicapin. We could hardly believe ourselves the same miserable beings who had been a few hours before tossing on the lake, in dread alike of the bottom and of another night on board the Bungo. The reader must have gone through what we had to form any idea of our enjoyment.